Don't move. Follow me. The boy's voice was calm, almost impossibly calm, yet it cut through the chatter of executives, the crackle of construction radios, and the steady rumble of diesel engines like a single note no one could ignore. Daniel Whitmore stopped with one polished leather shoe suspended above the concrete, surprised that anyone, let alone a young black boy in faded sneakers and a weathered hoodie, would dare interrupt him seconds before the biggest inspection of his career. Around them, the construction site stretched across nearly 40 acres outside Charlotte, North Carolina, wrapped in orange fencing and lined with towering cranes that painted long shadows across the morning pavement. Investors waited near the temporary office trailers. Engineers held rolled blueprints beneath their arms. Reporters adjusted camera lenses, hoping to capture Daniel's arrival before the official announcement of a billion-dollar redevelopment project that promised to transform the forgotten industrial district into luxury apartments, shopping centers, and parks. His security team reacted immediately. One stepped forward with an impatient sigh while another reached toward the boy's shoulder. "Son, you need to back away," the taller guard said firmly, assuming this was another child hoping for an autograph or a donation. But the boy didn't even glance at the men surrounding him. His brown eyes never left Daniel's face. They weren't frightened. They weren't pleading. They were focused with the quiet certainty of someone who had already made up his mind. "Please," he repeated softly. "Don't stand here. Just follow me." Daniel frowned. People usually wanted something from him. Money, connections, jobs, attention. This boy wanted only movement. The request made no sense, yet something about it refused to leave his mind. The executives waiting several yards away exchanged puzzled looks. One of them laughed under his breath, whispering that they were already running behind schedule. Another checked his expensive watch and muttered that television crews were waiting. Daniel could feel dozens of eyes fixed on him, expecting him to dismiss the interruption and continue toward the ceremonial ribbon. Instead, he studied the child standing before him. The boy couldn't have been older than 11. His hoodie sleeves were slightly too long, his jeans carried patches at both knees, and dust clung stubbornly to the worn rubber soles of his shoes. Yet despite everything that suggested hardship, his posture remained steady. There was no panic in him, only urgency. The billionaire slowly lowered his foot back onto the pavement. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elijah Brooks," the boy answered without hesitation. "And if you trust me, we need to leave now." The security guards exchanged uncertain glances. One quietly spoke into his earpiece, while another scanned the area for anything unusual. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Forklifts moved across the gravel. Surveyors checked measurements. Workers laughed over paper coffee cups. A warm spring breeze carried the scent of fresh asphalt and damp earth through the site. Nothing looked dangerous. Nothing sounded wrong. Yet Daniel noticed something unexpected. Elijah wasn't looking at the cranes or the machinery. He kept staring toward the concrete entrance road behind Daniel, as though listening for something no one else could hear. For reasons Daniel couldn't explain, a strange feeling settled over him, one that years of business experience had taught him never to ignore. Every major decision he'd ever made had begun with facts, numbers, and contracts. This one began with the steady eyes of a child the world barely seemed to notice. Daniel Whitmore glanced toward the waiting executives, then back at Elijah Brooks. Every instinct built from 3 decades of billion-dollar negotiations told him this decision was irrational. Every schedule, every security protocol, and every public relations advisor would have expected him to ignore the child and continue toward the presentation stage where cameras were already pointing in his direction. Yet the certainty in Elijah's expression refused to fade. It was not confidence born from pride. It looked more like responsibility, the kind that arrived long before childhood was supposed to end. Daniel slowly raised one hand, signaling his security detail to stand down. "Give us 1 minute," he said quietly. The guards hesitated before stepping back, though none of them lowered their attention. Elijah nodded once and immediately turned toward a narrow service road running behind a row of abandoned brick warehouses that had survived decades of neglect. Without looking back, he walked with quick but measured steps, never running, never showing fear. Daniel followed, hearing confused voices growing quieter behind him as every step carried them farther from the ceremonial entrance. The sound of television crews faded until only the distant hum of heavy equipment and birds resting on rusted steel beams remained. The alley smelled of damp concrete, old lumber, and wild grass pushing through cracked pavement. Sunlight filtered between broken warehouse windows, drawing long golden lines across the ground. Elijah finally slowed near a chain-link fence covered with climbing vines. He stopped and looked toward the main entrance from nearly 200 feet away. Daniel noticed the boy taking a slow breath before speaking again. "You came," Elijah said. "Most people never do." Daniel folded his hands inside the pockets of his tailored coat. "You still have not told me why you brought me here." Elijah lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. "Because everybody important walks through the front gate. Nobody ever walks back here." Daniel followed the direction of the boy's gaze. From this angle, the construction entrance looked completely different. Large supply trucks rolled in one after another, while workers guided traffic with orange flags. Engineers clustered around survey markers, reviewing measurements on digital tablets. Nothing appeared unusual. Still, Elijah kept watching with remarkable patience. "My grandmother says you learn more by listening than by talking," he said softly. "So I listen every day after school." Daniel studied him more carefully. "You come here often?" Elijah nodded. "Almost every afternoon. I collect aluminum cans and scrap wire around the old factories. It helps pay for groceries and my grandmother's medicine." His voice carried no embarrassment, only simple honesty. "I know every shortcut, every broken sidewalk, every place where the ground sounds different when trucks drive over it." Daniel felt genuine curiosity, replacing his earlier skepticism. "You know this property better than some of my engineers." Elijah offered the smallest smile. "They came a few months ago. I have lived around here my whole life." A gust of wind stirred loose papers caught beneath the fence. Somewhere in the distance, a warning horn echoed briefly before fading again. Elijah's expression changed almost instantly. He tilted his head slightly, as though recognizing a familiar sound hidden beneath everything else. Daniel noticed it this time. The boy was not simply looking. He was listening. Listening with the focus of someone who had learned that survival sometimes depended on hearing what everyone else ignored. Then Elijah whispered, almost to himself, "It is happening earlier today." Daniel felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as Elijah remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed beyond the chain-link fence. The billionaire listened carefully, trying to separate the countless sounds drifting across the property. There were engines idling, backup alarms echoing across the gravel, workers calling measurements to one another, and the distant clatter of steel being unloaded. To Daniel, it blended into ordinary construction noise. To Elijah, it clearly did not. "What is happening?" Daniel asked quietly. Elijah pointed toward a line of temporary utility markers running beneath the entrance road. The sound changed. Daniel frowned. "Changed how?" The boy searched for the right words. "Usually the trucks make one deep sound when they pass over that part of the road. Today it echoes underneath. My grandmother says old places talk if you pay attention." Daniel looked again, still unable to understand what Elijah was hearing. Before he could respond, one of his security officers hurried around the corner, breathing harder than before. "Sir, everyone is looking for you. The mayor just arrived. We need to get you back." Daniel nodded politely, but did not move. "Give me another minute." The guard glanced toward Elijah with visible doubt before stepping back again. Elijah noticed the expression but simply looked away. He had seen that look before. Adults often smiled politely at him before dismissing whatever he tried to tell them. Daniel sensed the quiet disappointment crossing the boy's face. "Has this happened before?" he asked. Elijah slowly nodded. 3 mornings ago, I smelled something strange near the front gate, like metal and rotten eggs together. Yesterday, the trucks sounded different when they drove over that road. I told one of the workers. "What did he say?" Daniel asked. Elijah shrugged. "He said I should stop wandering around and leave the construction work to grown-ups." Daniel remained silent. "Then I told another man wearing a white hard hat. He laughed and gave me $5 because he thought I was asking for money." The boy reached into the pocket of his faded hoodie and carefully unfolded a worn receipt with several handwritten notes covering the back. He handed it to Daniel. Small pencil marks showed dates, times, and simple observations. Monday, strange smell. Tuesday, ground shakes longer after trucks pass. Wednesday morning, loud hollow sound beneath the entrance road. Daniel stared at the paper much longer than he expected. The handwriting was neat despite the wrinkled page. Every note had a time beside it. Every detail was specific. You wrote all of this yourself? Daniel asked. Elijah nodded. My grandmother tells me that if people do not believe your words, write them down anyway, because truth does not disappear just because somebody ignores it. Daniel looked at the child with growing respect. This was not imagination. This was careful observation. Behind them, the wind shifted direction, carrying another faint odor across the alley. Daniel caught it this time. It was subtle but unmistakable, unusual enough to make him pause. Elijah immediately looked toward the entrance again. His shoulders became tense. Several heavily loaded cement trucks had begun rolling slowly through the main gate one after another. The ground beneath Daniel's polished shoes seemed to vibrate almost imperceptibly. Elijah whispered so softly that only Daniel could hear him. It is starting now. Please do not let anyone else stand. There. Daniel Whitmore did not hesitate another second. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket and dialed the site's superintendent directly. The call connected almost immediately. Stop every vehicle entering through the main gate, Daniel said, his voice steady and unmistakably firm. Clear the entrance road now. There was a brief silence before the superintendent replied with obvious confusion. Sir, we are seconds away from the ceremony. The structural reports were approved. Is there a problem? Daniel looked toward Elijah, whose eyes remained fixed on the stream of heavy trucks slowly approaching the checkpoint. Do it, Daniel answered. I will explain later. The line went quiet before the superintendent finally responded. Yes, sir. Moments later, whistles echoed across the construction site. Workers turned in every direction as traffic controllers lifted their bright red stop paddles. One by one, the cement trucks slowed to a halt outside the entrance. Drivers leaned out of their windows, puzzled by the unexpected order. Executives standing near the ribbon ceremony exchanged bewildered looks. Reporters lowered their cameras, sensing that something unusual had interrupted the carefully planned event. Several investors approached Daniel from across the lot, their polished shoes crunching across loose gravel. Daniel, one of them called. What is going on? The mayor is waiting. Another executive glanced toward Elijah and lowered his voice. Please do not tell me this delay is because of that kid. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he kept watching the entrance road. Beside him, Elijah quietly counted beneath his breath. 1, 2, 3. Daniel noticed the rhythm, but did not interrupt. The breeze shifted again, carrying the same faint odor that had drifted through the alley only minutes earlier. This time several workers wrinkled their noses as well, though none appeared especially concerned. The superintendent hurried over wearing a white hard hat, and an expression caught somewhere between frustration and respect. Sir, everyone has stopped moving just like you ordered. The engineering team says the road passed inspection last week. Daniel handed him the folded receipt Elijah had shown him. Read it. The superintendent skimmed the handwritten notes, then looked toward Elijah with visible skepticism. These observations came from him. Daniel nodded. Have your people check that section immediately. Before the superintendent could respond, an older engineer carrying a digital tablet stepped forward. Sir, we already completed the standard ground scans before sunrise. Everything was within acceptable limits. Elijah finally spoke, his voice gentle enough that nobody felt challenged. Did anybody check after the fourth cement truck crossed this morning? The engineer blinked. No. Why would we? Elijah pointed toward the entrance road. Because yesterday there were only 2 trucks that heavy. Today there are 8. The engineer stared at the boy for a long moment before turning back toward the road, uncertainty replacing confidence. Daniel noticed the subtle change immediately. It was the first time anyone besides him had truly listened instead of dismissing the child. The superintendent quickly called 2 inspectors over the radio and directed them toward the entrance with portable testing equipment. Minutes passed in tense silence. The construction site, so full of movement only moments earlier, now stood almost perfectly still beneath the bright Carolina sun. Even the reporters stopped talking, sensing that everyone was waiting for an answer. Then one inspector suddenly lowered his equipment, looked toward the superintendent, and slowly removed his hard hat. The color drained from his face as he spoke into the radio. Sir, I think you need to come see this. The readings underneath the entrance road are not matching the inspection report anymore. The superintendent sprinted toward the inspection team, followed closely by Daniel Whitmore, several engineers, and a growing crowd of anxious executives. Elijah remained a few steps behind, saying nothing. He had already said everything that mattered. The lead inspector knelt beside a fresh scan marker painted on the pavement and pointed at the screen mounted on the portable detector. The digital graph fluctuated wildly before settling into a pattern none of the engineers expected to see. "There is a void beneath this section," the inspector said carefully. "It is much larger than our original survey indicated." A second inspector arrived carrying additional equipment and repeated the measurements from 3 different locations. Each reading confirmed the same unsettling conclusion. The ground beneath the entrance road was no longer stable. Quiet murmurs spread through the gathering crowd. Construction managers unfolded blueprints across the hood of a pickup truck, while structural engineers compared the new data with archived geological surveys from decades earlier. One older engineer suddenly stopped turning the pages. "There used to be an underground utility tunnel here," he said slowly. "It was abandoned nearly 50 years ago." Another engineer looked up in disbelief. That tunnel was supposed to have been completely filled before this property changed ownership. The older man shook his head. According to these records, only part of it was reinforced. The remaining section may have weakened over time. Daniel looked toward the halted line of cement trucks waiting outside the gate. If they had continued entering according to schedule, thousands of pounds of additional weight would have rolled directly across the compromised area. The realization settled over everyone without another word being spoken. One of the investors quietly removed his glasses and stared at the motionless roadway. Moments earlier, he had been impatient about a delayed ceremony. Now he seemed grateful for every passing second. Nearby, several television reporters lowered their microphones as the story unfolding before them became far more important than any prepared announcement. The superintendent slowly walked toward Elijah. His face carried none of the doubt it had shown only minutes earlier. "Son," he asked gently, "how did you notice something our instruments missed?" Elijah glanced at the cracked pavement before answering. "I did not know about tunnels. I only noticed that the trucks sounded different every day. Then the smell came. My grandmother always says the ground tells the truth before people do." The superintendent nodded silently. There was no easy response to wisdom delivered with such simple honesty. Daniel felt something shift inside him as he looked at the boy standing quietly beside the fence. Elijah was not asking for praise. He was not smiling because he had been proven right. He seemed relieved only because everyone had finally stopped to listen. At that moment, another inspector approached carrying a weathered metal maintenance box recovered from the edge of the property. Inside were faded inspection logs dating back many years. He opened the brittle folder and carefully turned several yellowed pages before stopping on one report. "Sir," he said, looking directly at Daniel, "these maintenance records show repeated recommendations for a complete underground inspection. Every recommendation was marked as postponed." Daniel accepted the folder with steady hands. The final signature approving those postponements belonged to the previous development company that had owned the site years before. He slowly closed the file, then looked toward Elijah once more. The boy had protected hundreds of people simply by paying attention to details everyone else had overlooked, and Daniel realized that the greatest lesson of the morning had nothing to do with engineering, construction, or business. It was about the extraordinary value of listening before it was too late. Silence settled over the construction site in a way Daniel Whitmore had never experienced before. The engines had been turned off. The backup alarms were gone. Even the reporters who had spent the morning competing for the loudest headline now stood quietly behind their cameras, watching a different kind of story unfold. Sunlight reflected from the windows of the abandoned warehouses, casting warm bands of light across the empty entrance road that had nearly welcomed hundreds of tons of traffic only minutes earlier. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh pine from the tree line beyond the property, replacing the faint odor that had first caught Elijah's attention. The change seemed almost symbolic. Daniel slowly walked away from the cluster of engineers until he reached the old chain-link fence, where Elijah stood alone, tracing small circles in the dust with the toe of his worn sneaker. The boy looked exhausted now that the urgency had passed. His shoulders had relaxed, and the determination that had carried him through the morning gave way to the quiet expression of an ordinary 11-year-old who suddenly remembered he still had homework waiting at home. Daniel stopped beside him without speaking for several seconds. Neither of them looked at the other. They simply watched the construction site together. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. You knew nobody would believe you, did you? Elijah smiled faintly without lifting his eyes. I hoped somebody would. Daniel nodded slowly. Why me? Elijah took a deep breath before answering. Because everybody else was already busy. The simplicity of the answer settled heavily on Daniel's heart. Throughout his career, he had built companies by trusting experts, consultants, engineers, attorneys, economists, and analysts. Yet the person who had protected everyone that morning was a child carrying handwritten notes on the back of an old grocery receipt. Daniel looked down at Elijah's hands. The small pencil marks still stained his fingertips. Does your grandmother know you come here after school? Elijah nodded. She worries every day? Then why keep coming? Daniel asked gently. Elijah looked toward the old warehouses glowing beneath the afternoon sun. Because this neighborhood is home. If something bad happens here, it happens to us first. Daniel felt those words linger longer than any business presentation he had ever heard. There was no accusation in the boy's voice. Only truth. Across the property, workers began carefully placing new safety barriers around the entrance while engineers prepared a full underground survey. Nobody complained about the delay anymore. The schedule no longer mattered. People moved more slowly now, speaking with greater patience, as though the morning had quietly reminded everyone that progress meant very little if it ignored the people living closest to it. Daniel reached into his pocket and unfolded Elijah's handwritten notes once again. He read every line carefully, this time, noticing something he had overlooked before. At the bottom of the page, beneath all the dates and observations, Elijah had written one final sentence in careful block letters. Maybe tomorrow somebody will listen. Daniel folded the paper with extraordinary care and slipped it back into his coat pocket. Looking at Elijah, he realized that the greatest investment he could make would not begin with concrete, steel, or blueprints. It would begin with making certain that children like this one would never have to wonder again whether anyone was willing to hear their voice. The next morning, Daniel Whitmore canceled every executive meeting on his calendar for the first time in years. Instead of flying back to New York on his private jet, he sat inside a temporary office overlooking the silent construction site, surrounded by engineering reports, inspection records, and the worn grocery receipt Elijah had filled with careful observations. His legal team had already completed a preliminary review, and every new document pointed toward the same uncomfortable truth. For months, warning signs had existed in plain sight. Minor vibration reports had been dismissed as normal construction activity. Small maintenance concerns had been delayed to avoid interrupting the project schedule. Most painful of all, the site's supervisor finally located 3 handwritten visitor reports submitted by a young neighborhood boy describing unusual smells and strange sounds beneath the entrance road. Each report had been stamped, filed, and quietly forgotten. Daniel stared at the papers without speaking. They had not ignored the evidence because it lacked detail. They had ignored it because they had never expected valuable information to come from an 11-year-old black child wearing worn sneakers and carrying a bag of aluminum cans. The realization settled heavily across the room. Nobody tried to defend the mistake. Later that afternoon, Daniel asked one simple question. Where does Elijah live? An assistant quietly handed him an address only 6 blocks from the construction site. The neighborhood looked nothing like the glossy architectural renderings prepared for investors. Small brick homes stood beside aging apartment buildings. Front porches carried flower pots made from old paint buckets. Children rode bicycles along cracked sidewalks while elderly neighbors greeted one another from folding chairs beneath wide oak trees. Daniel stepped out of his vehicle without cameras, reporters, or executives following behind. He carried only a plain brown envelope and Elijah's folded notes inside his coat pocket. A small white house appeared at the end of the street with a carefully swept front porch and bright yellow flowers growing beside handmade wooden steps. An elderly woman looked up from watering her garden as Daniel approached. Her silver hair caught the afternoon sunlight, and gentle lines around her eyes spoke of years spent smiling despite difficult seasons. "Good afternoon," she said warmly. "Can I help you?" Daniel removed his sunglasses. "My name is Daniel Whitmore. I believe your grandson helped me yesterday." Before the woman could answer, the front door opened and Elijah stepped outside carrying a library book beneath one arm. His eyes widened with surprise. "Sir." Daniel smiled for the first time since arriving. I came to return something. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the grocery receipt with extraordinary care. Elijah accepted it as though it were far more valuable than the paper itself. I thought I lost this, he whispered. Daniel shook his head gently. No, I think the rest of us almost lost something much more important. Elijah looked confused. His grandmother quietly rested one hand on his shoulder, sensing that this visit meant far more than gratitude. Daniel glanced toward the modest neighborhood surrounding them. He suddenly understood that while billion-dollar projects could reshape skylines, real change always began by recognizing the dignity, wisdom, and courage already living inside communities that too many people had learned to overlook. At that moment, he silently promised himself that this neighborhood would never again be treated as a place people simply drove past without listening to those who called it home. Daniel Whitmore returned to the construction site 3 days later, but this time there was no ribbon, no stage, and no carefully rehearsed speeches. Instead, folding chairs filled the open lot, occupied not only by investors and engineers, but also by families from the surrounding neighborhood. Children sat beside grandparents. Teachers stood beside construction workers. Local business owners chatted quietly with city officials. For the first time since the redevelopment project had been announced, the people who actually lived there had been invited before any cameras were switched on. Daniel stepped to the microphone, holding no prepared speech. He looked across the crowd until his eyes found Elijah Brooks sitting beside his grandmother in the second row. The boy looked uncomfortable with so much attention, quietly holding the same library book he had carried a few days earlier. Daniel smiled before speaking. This project nearly taught me the most expensive lesson of my career. Fortunately, an 11-year-old boy taught it to me first. The crowd turned toward Elijah, who immediately lowered his eyes. Daniel continued. Many people have called Elijah a hero this week. I believe they are only partly correct. He did not become extraordinary because he noticed something unusual. He became extraordinary because he cared enough to speak up even after people ignored him. The audience remained completely silent. The failure was never his. The failure belonged to every adult who decided his voice was too easy to overlook. Several construction managers slowly lowered their heads. The superintendent stood quietly near the back of the gathering, listening with folded hands. Daniel reached into his jacket and removed the carefully preserved grocery receipt. This piece of paper has become one of the most valuable documents I have ever owned, he said. Not because it contains technical information, because it reminds me that wisdom is not measured by age, wealth, job titles, or expensive offices. He then announced that the redevelopment plans would immediately change. Before a single luxury apartment would be built, the company would completely reinforce the underground infrastructure, renovate neighborhood sidewalks, improve drainage systems, and create a permanent community advisory council where local residents, including students, would have direct opportunities to report safety concerns. Applause spread gradually before growing into a warm, standing ovation. Daniel looked toward Elijah again. There is one more announcement. He invited the boy and his grandmother onto the stage. Both hesitated before slowly walking forward together. Daniel knelt so he could meet Elijah at eye level. Your notes reminded me that listening changes lives. I would like to create the Elijah Brooks Community Scholarship for young students who use curiosity, observation, and kindness to improve their neighborhoods. Elijah blinked several times, clearly overwhelmed. Sir, he said softly, I only wanted everybody to be safe. Daniel nodded. Exactly. That is why this scholarship should carry your name. Elijah looked toward his grandmother. Tears glistened gently in her eyes, but her smile never faded. She squeezed her grandson's shoulder with quiet pride. In that moment, the applause filling the construction site was not celebrating wealth or success. It was celebrating a child whose courage had reminded an entire community that the strongest foundation any city could ever build was the simple decision to truly listen to one another. 1 year later, the same piece of land looked almost unrecognizable. The abandoned warehouses had become community learning spaces covered with colorful murals painted by local artists. The cracked sidewalks had been replaced with smooth walking paths lined with young maple trees whose leaves danced gently in the Carolina breeze. Children raced across a new playground where rusted fences had once stood, while families gathered beneath shaded picnic shelters on a warm Saturday afternoon. The construction project had been completed months earlier, but the greatest change could not be measured in square feet or property values. It could only be seen in the way people looked at one another. Daniel Whitmore walked slowly through the neighborhood, without a security detail surrounding him. He greeted store owners by name, stopped to shake hands with construction workers who had stayed to mentor local apprentices, and smiled as children waved while riding their bicycles through the park. His expensive watch still rested on his wrist, but he no longer checked it every few minutes. Some lessons quietly changed the rhythm of a person's life. Near the center of the park stood a small bronze plaque surrounded by flowers. It did not mention billion-dollar investments or record-breaking developments. Instead, it carried a simple inscription. This community stands because one child believed that speaking the truth mattered, even when no one was listening. Daniel paused there for a long moment before hearing familiar footsteps behind him. Elijah Brooks, now a little taller than the year before, approached carrying a backpack filled with library books instead of aluminum cans. His sneakers were newer, but the calm kindness in his eyes remained exactly the same. "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore," he said with an easy smile. Daniel returned the smile warmly. "How is school?" Elijah laughed softly. "Busy. My science teacher says I ask too many questions." Daniel chuckled. "Keep asking them. The world needs more people who notice what others overlook." Together they walked toward the community garden where Elijah's grandmother was carefully tending rows of tomatoes, herbs, and bright yellow sunflowers. She looked up as they approached, her smile as warm as the afternoon sunlight stretching across the garden beds. "I was wondering when the two of you would get here," she said. Elijah knelt beside her without a word, helping remove a few small weeds while Daniel quietly picked up a watering can and began watering the flowers. No reporters watched. No photographers waited nearby. There were no speeches, no ceremonies, and no applause. Only three people sharing an ordinary afternoon in a neighborhood that had learned the extraordinary value of listening. As the sun slowly drifted lower, golden light reflected across the windows of the new community center built where the dangerous entrance road had once stood. Children's laughter floated through the air, blending with birdsong and the gentle rustling of leaves overhead. Daniel looked toward Elijah, remembering the quiet voice that had changed everything with only a few simple words spoken on an ordinary morning. He finally understood that true strength was never measured by wealth, influence, or authority. It was measured by the courage to care, the humility to listen, and the kindness to act before it was too late. The evening breeze carried the scent of fresh earth through the garden as the three of them continued working side by side. And in that peaceful silence, justice no longer needed to announce itself because it had already become part of everyday life.